Okay, so that's a yes to more air defense. That's a no to anti-satellite weapons. And that is a yes to nukes. Huh. Welcome back, everyone. Germany just published its first national security strategy paper. Yes, it is called Robust, Resilient and Sustainable. Yeah, integrated security for Germany. Now, yes, this is the first national security strategy paper for Reunified Germany, so this in 30 years' time, essentially. Yes, Germany did have some security-related papers that they had published, for example, the white paper in 2016, and then a couple of related papers that went into this field of security as well, sometimes thinking about cyberspace and so on. But as a complete, full document, giving a vision of what Germany thinks its national security strategy should be and lining that out. This is the first one. And what I'm going to do in this episode is I'm going to talk about all the air domain related aspects of this paper and then give you some more general impressions here. And yeah, that should give us a good overall impression of what this document is all about. Now, very important here, of course, you notice the national security strategy papers, they are usually a bit more generalist in term. They can sometimes go into very intricate detail, but usually they're more generalist in terms, so they're not necessarily going to name drop specific weapon systems and so on and so forth, but you know that, of course. So let's get cracking with the air domain stuff. First up on the list here is Germany wants to have a leading role or a more concerted effort for air defense. So they specifically say, furthermore, the federal government will strive to strengthen European air defense capabilities within the NATO framework. Now, this is not necessarily surprising. So, of course, this document finds its birth, really, with Russia's escalatory full-scale invasion in February 2022 of Ukraine. And one of the things that really emerged in the German discussion, starting around the second quarter of 2022, was this idea of strengthening air defense across Europe with concentrated effort of integrating different systems, creating new systems, there was even the talk of creating a Iron Dome-like system. You know, that discussion went nowhere initially, but it's interesting to see that this is picked up again here in the paper, even though it's just in one separate, albeit very short paragraph. It is also something that I think that politically speaking is very safe for Germany to say, because it's more defensive in nature and it's an easier sell to the public. And in fact, one of the things that is emerging also in some of the expert circles with defense studies and security studies is thinking about more specialized focus of different armies in Europe, of providing one specific service to not just their country, but of course the whole NATO framework as well. And one of the things that has often been suggested here is that Germany, and specifically the Luftwaffe, should focus on air defense. So Typhoons doing more DCA, defensive counter-air, and that air defense should generally be strengthened as well. And this also harks back a little bit to that Cold War legacy that West Germany had, where they did invest in a lot of air defense for combat troops up front, with Gepard and Roland, for example, and then also getting Patriot systems from the US, and Patriot, of course, still playing a major role in the German armed forces as well now, with the upgrade to PAC-3 recently, and potentially also further deployments in NATO countries with German air defense systems, which are American, but you know what I mean. Okay, so that's air defense ticked off here. Then there is an interesting note here about ASAT. So what I found interesting generally about the document as well is that space is now branched off from all other aspects, which is not necessarily a German tradition. They generally didn't conceptualize space that much just yet, but recently they of course opened the Weltraumkommando, so essentially German Space Force, although it is still nestled, not as a separate branch, but still nestled within the Luftwaffe. But one of the things that they have done, I'm on the wrong page, here we go, is they talk about ASATs. And I include them here simply because a lot of ASAT systems that have been tested in the past are also air-launched. So what they're saying is, Germany is a role model with its voluntary commitment not to conduct any destructive anti-satellite tests with ground-based, air-based or sea-based anti-satellite missiles. Now this sort of language that we see here with them saying a role model, voluntary commitment, and so on and so forth, that's very reminiscent of what we saw from Germany in the past, with it trying to sort of take a leading role, a facilitating role in pushing towards more conflict resolutory stances and trying to get people not really to acquire new military hardware and so on and so forth. We've seen that hasn't really worked out in Germany's favors, or perhaps even in NATO's favor. But it's interesting to say that they specifically highlight this weapon system, but that's also not necessarily surprising. ASATs have generally, so anti-satellite missiles, have generally been getting a bad rep, and this concept has in theory been dead since the 1960s, 1970s, simply because all major countries, even though they have recently been tested by China and Russia on ASAT, that the risk is simply too large, because if you shoot down a satellite, you're going to create a lot of small debris, so FOD, and that's going to result in what is called a Kessler syndrome or Kessler effect, where it's a cascading destruction of ever more satellites as these small pieces are just essentially flung into all directions from the lower orbit, even into higher orbits, and they're hitting more and more satellites, and that's just can shut down the whole the orbit infrastructure with satellites. Of course, there are now starting to be concepts of orbit cleaning devices as well, but right now most countries have realized that this is really not a way forward, although some countries are still investing in those capabilities. Germany not doing this doesn't really surprise all that much, because first of all, nowadays with satellite spoofing or jamming or non-kinetic destruction as well, those sort of systems starting to make an appearance. It's not necessarily required anymore to destroy a satellite, especially considering the risk that's involved. Okay, now turning to the big one, nukes. I think most of you know this. Germany is in what is called the NATO nuclear sharing program, where it and a couple of NATO partners have access but not control over US nukes. So specifically the B-61 bomb, and currently Germany is theoretically able to deploy those with its Tornado fleet. And Tornado was also in parts, I would say, kept in service simply for Germany to retain that obligation and that commitment to NATO nuclear sharing, and also to say, hey, we're doing our parts, because if push comes to shove and nukes have to be deployed as a retaliatory measure against another country, then with the US giving its okay, German Tornadoes would deploy those nukes. Now, the B-61, they're yes, it's a variable yield bomb, but it's not, don't think of like this big, massive nuclear explosion. I think the maximum yield that you can get on B-61s is like 320 kilotons or something like that. So it's a more of a tactical nuke, but it is still a nuke. One of the things that is also, of course, helping or has facilitated the sale of F-35 to Germany is the fact that F-35 was also already certified on the B-61, whereas Typhoon, Eurofighter Typhoon, is not, and that would have required a lot of data sharing between Eurofighter platform and the American partners, of course, as well as a whole certification procedure with weapons testing, avionics changes, and so on and so forth. So with F-35, that capability comes in natively, and it's an easy shoe in here as well. This is not surprising at all, but it is interesting to see it from a political standpoint, because NATO's nuclear sharing program has caused some controversy in the past between civilian actors who said, hey, Germany really shouldn't have any nukes. We don't want nukes in Germany, and so on and so forth. And the government saying, well, this is our commitment to NATO. However, I will stress that this has never actually been that big of an issue that you would expect from a country that got rid of, for example, nuclear power because of the risks involved, or what some groups thought of the risks involved. And drones, for example, so UNV, weaponized drones, have been a much more intensely debated subject than nukes on German aircraft, which is interesting. Also, drones and UAVs do not appear at all in this document. So that is us generally done now with the air domain. I want to talk about some overall impressions from this document, however, because I think it's interesting. It really, really is interesting what we're seeing here, because So overall, this is a very safe entry, I would say, into the field of national security strategy papers. It doesn't really have any big upsets, it doesn't really have any big surprises. The language is generally consistent with what we've seen previously, but it does spice it up just a little bit. It does provide that pepper every now and then, where it shows that yes, there have been some changes here, and there have been some shifts as well in the perceptions of what is required for national defense and where really the importance lies for Germany, and that there has been a recognition that yes, a little bit more has to be done on national defense security and also the armed forces. So that's overall good to see. And then again, considering that this is also the product of a political coalition, so currently in Germany we have the Social Democrats, the Greens and the Liberals in a ruling coalition. The fact that this was postponed 2 times, once in February, once in May, shows that yeah, there is a little bit of catering to the lowest common denominator in some of these aspects, which is to be expected given the fact that you have a ruling coalition. And some of the language specifically, for example, I would say on China, is contradictory and doesn't really show the same sort of appreciation of China as a strategic adversary, even though that is recognized in parts, but it doesn't really have that same, shall we say, urgency as we see, for example, with comparative statements from, for example, the United States or even here in Great Britain as well. So that's not that big of a surprise yet, however, because of course this document was birthed through the Zeitenwende, so which was of course kickstarted through by the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. And considering that there's a war in Europe going on at the moment, you'd expect there to be a little bit more focus on that than China. What we're also seeing is that there is still a very strong emphasis on multilateral frameworks, for example, NATO or the EU, and that is reminiscent of what we have seen earlier from Germany. It's always focused on doing everything multilaterally and not really being, except for being a role model, but not really being sort of the driving force behind something. It always wants to have France on board. The commitment or the friendship with France is highlighted in the document actually quite strongly again, but always doing something with the allies rather than setting the tone and charging forward and pulling people with it. Or pulling other states with it. So yes, there is still that language there, but that's to be expected because those shifts, even though we are seeing a shift in language here, those very strong shifts it would have been surprising to see those here, simply because things do not move that fast politically or bureaucratically, because a lot of this stuff is of course also written by bureaucrats. I just noticed during the edit that I forgot one very important thing in the document, and that is that there is one specific sentence, in fact, that says this, that is that there is no credible deterrence if you do not have the means to back it up. That is to say, yes, Germany wants to move ahead mainly through diplomatic approaches, as basically do we all, but it has recognized that in order to show off that it is capable of defending itself and also being part of the NATO defense framework, the capabilities have to be there to back up your red lines, let's say, with a credible armed force. Finally, I do want to make a quantitative analysis here just to give you an idea of how many times certain keywords were dropped. So we can see that certain countries come up multiple times. China 6 times, Russia and Ukraine each roughly 10 times. And we see, of course, that commitment to multilateral frameworks, or the importance of multilateral frameworks in this document being reflected also in the amount of times NATO and the EU was mentioned. Germany, of course, being mentioned oftentimes because this is Germany's paper. And then the word European yields the most hits. So that gives you sort of an overall impression of where the center of gravity lies in terms of wording, and that is reflected also, generally speaking, from what you see from this document. What I want to do specifically in the future as well, look a little bit more at the space aspect of this, because I find it interesting that that has been decoupled from previous documents. It was always nestled in like cyber or hybrid air sometimes, not even. But yeah, now it's separated as a specific section, a specific subchapter in here, and that is really interesting to see. So maybe I'll do something on that in the future as well. I will provide a link to this document in the description. So if you want to read it in English, it is available indeed in English. Let me know what you think about this document and what I've been telling you about the air domain and my overall impressions in the comments below. What do you expect from Germany at this point? What would you have liked seeing in this document regarding the air domain? Let me know. That would be really interesting to see your takes and impressions on this. And big thank you here to patrons and channel members, because you sponsor this sort of content that allows me to, well, go through a national security strategy paper, which isn't really the big hype machine, I guess, in terms of YouTube audience view stuff. But it's the content that I really appreciate making for all of you. And thanks to patrons and channel members, it's possible. So if you want to support this sort of content, you can also check that out in the description below with support options via Patreon or channel memberships. You also get early access to videos as well as Discord access. And also, big announcement, I'm coming to America to film, and yes, that's going to be announced separately again. But if you're watching this video, you have had notice. Check out the description again. There's a link there sending you to the crowdfunding page that has been requested by a lot of you in trying to make this filming trip happen. So if you want to help out and also at the same time get some nice perks and exclusive rewards from that as well, do check that out. And now, yeah, as always, I wish all you legends a great day and see you in the sky.